Hi everybody, welcome back to English 90. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 8th of December, where we are nearing the ending of the semester. So today I wanted to talk a little bit more about paper 4 as well as quoting and the final examination. If you'll remember, paper number 4 is going to be a 5-paragraph essay because now we're at the point of the semester where basically all writing should be 5 or more paragraphs. That's really the expectation that your college professors are going to have in your other classes. So unless they tell you otherwise, what they're asking for is 5 or more paragraphs. And they'll usually talk about it in terms of page length. So 5 or more paragraphs would be approximately 2 pages. If they're asking for more than 2 pages, then they're asking for additional body paragraphs in the middle. If they were asking for 3 or 4 or 5 pages. Basically, you always have an introduction and you always have a conclusion. The difference is in the body. How many pieces of evidence are you going to be putting in your body? But the kinds of writings that you will be doing, while you may be writing about your personal experiences and your likes and dislikes, you also will probably be responding to the writing of others. So this is what paper number 4 is about, where I wanted to give you the opportunity to respond to an essay written by somebody else. So that said, what we've done is we've read 4 essays in our textbook over the course of the semester, and I'm asking you to choose one of those and to respond to one of those particular essays. You can see in the notes below that that's going to be due on the 15th, which happens to be a Wednesday, 11:59 p.m. via PDF to my email, and that's Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. So you've got a little bit of time to work on that. You should have gotten paper number 3 back from me, or if you haven't, you should get it back shortly. But I believe I've returned all of the paper number 3s that were submitted to me, at least submitted to me on time. And one of the things you'll need to do with this paper number 4, because you are responding to somebody else's writing, is quoting, which is something that we had talked about earlier in the semester. Remember, we had talked about the idea of using quote marks to indicate when you are taking a quote from the text. And that's from the Modern Language Association, or the MLA. And that's the system that basically you use when you are quoting from the humanities. And that also happens to be English classes. So there are different systems in place for other disciplines, for instance, for the sciences, but we aren't talking about that. And in fact, on page 440 of our textbook to 444, it talks a little bit about how you go about citing those sources, indicating where those sources come from. Because in addition to using the quotation marks, you've got to give the reader some information about where the reader can find that source so they can verify it for themselves. Basically, what you are doing is using parentheses, and we call that parenthetical documentation. Immediately after the quote, doesn't matter if the quote is ending the sentence or not, and I talked a little bit about this in a previous class. And in those parentheses, what you are doing is putting the least amount of information necessary for the reader in order to be able to determine where that particular quotation happens to be coming from. So in this particular instance, you can see that what we've got, in effect, is that at the ending of a quote in the parentheses, for our purposes, the least amount of information we would need would be the page number for where that particular essay appears. You don't need to write page or PG, you just need to write the numeral. Of course, it would be slightly different if we weren't using a print text, if we were using an online text. And it would also be somewhat different if it wasn't clear which text you were using. For instance, you were doing a research paper, you were gathering a lot of text on your own. But we're all using the same text in this particular class. So basically, what you are required to do is that at the ending of your quote, in parentheses, whether you finished your sentence or not, indicate the page number for where that particular quote appears. And it's something that I did in my essay topics as well so that you could see. And you can see that in the notes below, I've got some examples as well. For instance, the author S. Suzuki states, comma, here's a quote, "In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's, there are a few," close quote, and in the parentheses is the number 1, indicating that that appears on page 1 of the text. And if you're not done with your sentence, it would appear like the second example I have under section 2 of our notes. Quote, in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the experts, there are few, unquote. And then we see the parentheses with the 1, unquote. States author S. Suzuki. So you can see that what our textbook talks about on page 440 to 444 is what you would be doing if you continued on with this. You were actually writing something like a research paper. You would include something called a works cited page at the ending of your paper. And this includes all of the information of the text or text that you use to quote from. We aren't doing that for this particular class, but you will be doing this in your next level English class and in other classes as well. So I wanted you to know that that was there, and you can see how that is done by basically listing all of the text by author's last name in alphabetical order. And then there's certain criteria that you need to address if you are quoting from a book, slightly different if you're quoting from a magazine, slightly different if you're quoting from a website. So you get the idea. And basically you are including just major pieces of information. So in addition to the author's name, you're including things like title, place of publication, and publisher. Again, we aren't doing that for this particular class. What I wanted to do was to make sure that you could write a well-developed essay, which means 5 or more paragraphs, in response to somebody else's writing. And that also what you could do was to quote from their writing and indicate in parenthetical documentation, in parentheses after that quote, the page number for where that quote appears. So that's what we are going to be doing for paper number 4, which again, I'll talk a little bit more about next class. And also the final examination. And our final examination is going to be on the 20th, which is a Monday, at 10:30 a.m. That's the time we would have the final if we were meeting in person. So obviously we're not meeting in person. So what I'm going to be doing is posting the final on the 20th, Monday at 10:30. And it'll be very similar to the practice final and paper number 3 that you did with 5 paragraphs, just with different questions. I asked you to choose one and to write several paragraphs. That means 5 or more paragraphs. If you were writing this in class, you would have 2 hours to do it. But since we aren't in class, we're doing this online, I'm giving you 24 hours to do it. And it's open book, open notes, so you can use what resources that you would like. So if I'm posting it on the 20th, which is a Monday at 10:30 a.m., it would be due by the 21st, which happens to be a Tuesday, 10:30 a.m. via PDF to my email, ruiz, R-U-I-Z, @gcc.mass.edu. Again, I'll talk a little bit more about the final next class as well. So basically, for today's attendance question, and that's going to be due Thursday, the 9th at 10 a.m., do you have any questions that I can answer about the 4th paper or the final exam? And if so, what are those questions? If you don't have any questions, just say no, you don't have any questions, and you've satisfied the requirements for the attendance question. But again, I just wanted to make sure that you were understanding what our final is and what our final paper is. At this point, you should be working on your paper. So I'll end class a little bit early so that if you need the time for paper number 4, certainly you can use some of this time for constructing paper number 4. I'll finish up some odds and ends next class, and then we have our very final class, believe it or not. So I hope you're all doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class very briefly. You'll notice that it's scheduled as a catch-up class, just to make sure there are no questions or concerns. Take care. Bye-bye.